Lately I've been trying to create more depth in my paintings. Today I want to show you what I did with this Protea painting. I've talked about values and how they create a sense of depth before. Lighter values recede while darker values will come forward. With this Protea, I kept the back of the flower lighter in tonal value than the front of the flower to help create that sense of depth that I was looking for. That's not necessarily the way I saw it on my reference photo though. This is my reference photo. I took this myself when I was holidaying in New Zealand. Here, to my eye, the back of the flower is pretty much the same tonal value as the front of the flower. I can't see a great deal of difference there, but I know that in order to create depth in my painting, I'll need to vary those tonal values more. The area of your painting you want to draw attention to is where you should put your darkest values. I spoke about that last week. The reference photo, for me, it's only ever a guide, and I try not to follow it too closely. It's a starting point. I use it to get some information, but then when I've got what I need from it, I discard it and I stop looking at it. And that's when I focus on my painting and I try to improve on the photo. With this painting, you'll see me wash in all the light values. When I do that, I look at the photo and I look for the lightest areas. I'm not too worried about colour, that's secondary. It's the tonal values that I focus on. Then, once I've got all the light values painted in, I increase the tonal value and I paint in the mid-tones. At the end of the painting, I get out those beautiful darks and I increase the tonal contrast at the front of the flower further. I used 4 Winsor & Newton colours for this painting: Winsor Lemon, Permanent Rose, Burnt Sienna and Viridian, and I mixed everything I needed from those 4 colours. This is Arches hot pressed watercolour paper. It's the thick stuff. It's 640 GSM in weight. I started by painting some very pale Winsor Lemon on the dry paper. I watered the pigment down a lot because I didn't want to use a lot of colour here. I mixed some Permanent Rose and Viridian together, and now I want a lighter mixture of that, so I'll pull some of it away from the dark mixture and mix some water with it. And then I painted that onto the centre as well. The yellow that I put on there earlier is still wet, so where the 2 colours meet, I'll get that nice soft edge. This is on dry paper as well. The brush I'm using is a Da Vinci Maestro Series 35 and the size is a number 7. I love using these brushes because they hold a lot of paint and a lot of water and they've got a beautiful fine point. For the bracts at the back of the flower, I decided to wet the paper so that the paint would gently bleed. I used pale colours here as well because pale colours recede and I wanted the back of the Protea to look further away than the front. This is very pale Winsor Lemon that I'm painting on here. I wanted to use Permanent Rose on the Protea, but I didn't want it to be pure Permanent Rose. I wanted more of an earthy pink, so I mixed a small amount of Burnt Sienna into it to tone it down a notch or 2, and that's what you see here. I'm keeping the colour fairly pale and the paper is still wet, so the paint will bleed past the edges of each bract. Then I started to paint in the front of the flower. I painted each bract individually and I painted them on dry paper. I used pale Winsor Lemon down lower and then the Permanent Rose and Burnt Sienna mixture up higher. Because the yellow is wet, when I put the pink on, the 2 colours merge softly together where they touch one another. At this stage, I'm keeping the front of the flower fairly pale. Once this layer of paint goes on and dries, then I can start to paint in the mid-tones. On the lower part of the flower, I used the same colour that I used in the centre, which was a watered down mix of permanent rose and viridian. And I painted that area on dry paper as well. At this stage, I had the flower covered with all of my lightest values. Then I started to paint in the centre of the flower. I wanted some detail here, but I didn't want to spend too long agonising over it. I wet that centre section right at the top, and I painted on the mixture of viridian and permanent rose, but it's darker now. This is my number 3 round brush. It's not too big, but it's not overly small either. I can load it up with a fair amount of paint, but I can still paint a fine line with it when I need to. I'm painting over my pencil lines here on the dry paper. I soften edges where I need to, but generally all I'm doing is painting over my pencil lines. When that was done and dried, I used my eraser to remove any pencil lines that I could still see, any pencil lines that weren't covered with paint. Then I used my flat brush to wash over some clean water. This helps to soften any hard paint edges that draw the eye. I mixed a green and I started to paint that in down lower. Here I'm painting on dry paper. Turning my attention to the back of the flower again, I wanted to paint a few hard edges and define each bract. There were 2 things on my mind when I did this. One, I wanted to keep the colour fairly pale. I knew it needed to be a bit darker, but I wanted to make this part of the flower look further back than the front of the flower, so I needed to keep the colour fairly pale. And 2, I wanted to keep some soft and lost edges. I didn't want each bract to be completely defined with hard edges. If I could keep some lost edges, I knew that would also help to add some depth. I've just wet the paper here where the bract sits. I've got my permanent rose with a touch of burnt sienna mixed into it. I'm holding my brush right up on its tip and I'm painting along the edge of the bract. The paint bleeds with the water back into the bract, and you can see that I've skipped over parts of the edge so that I can keep some of those lost edges showing. I've just wet this one with water. I've got the paint mixture. You can see how I'm skipping over parts of it. The easiest way I found to do that was to put the paint where I can still see some of my pencil lines. Where I couldn't see a pencil line, I skipped over that area. Then I moved to the front of the flower. I needed to get my mid-tones in here. And again, I worked on each bract individually, but this time I worked on wet paper. Last time when I painted these in, I was working on the dry paper. So I wet each bract with water, and then I used my permanent rose mixture to start increasing the colour. I want to work on the wet paper here so that my paint edges will remain soft. I put it on there, and when I think I've got enough paint on there, I dip my brush into my water container to take the paint off. I dab it quickly on my paint cloth, and then I use the damp brush to pull the paint down the bract. I've got enough paint on there already, I don't need any more. I work my way around each bract doing the same thing. Wet them with water first, get the paint, put it on up the top, take the paint out of my brush and then pull that paint further down. So here I've got nothing on my brush, just moving that paint that's on there down a bit further, feathering off the edge. Down lower, I use the violet grey mixture on the wet paper, painting each bract individually. This is the Viridian and Permanent Rose mixture. I don't completely cover up that lighter underwash, you can still see it in places. Now I've got all my mid-tones painted in. What I have to do now is increase the tonal value on the front of the flower so that that area will advance forward more. I used the Permanent Rose Viridian mixture, even darker this time, in the centre of the Protea to darken some of those shadows there at the front. The paper is dry here. I'm using my number 3 round brush. If I need to soften any edges, I take the paint out of my brush and I use my damp brush to soften the paint edges. I'm concentrating it on the centre front, and then as I move my way around the sides, it gets a little bit lighter. Right up the top here, I'll wet it first and then I'll put some of that darker paint in there. Down the bottom of the flower here, I use that same colour. I paint it on the dry paper and then I take the paint out of my brush and soften the paint edge. I'm increasing the contrast by deepening the colours in the shadows. Here I'm painting on wet paper and I'm using the Permanent Rose Burnt Sienna mixture. I'll paint this on each bract at the front of the flower. So I wet it first. That allows me to keep my soft paint edges. And then I dab the darker paint on. I'll need to assess this. I may need to go darker again once it's dry. I'll have to have a look at it. I'll step back and I'll see what it looks like from a distance. And each time I put the paint on, you can see those other layers of paint. I'm not completely covering one layer with another layer. I painted in the leaves and the branch, and then I decided that I wanted to put even more colour at the front of the flower. This time I used pure Permanent Rose. To get a beautiful dark colour, I picked the paint up from the palette here, right next to the paint. That's as dark as I'm going to get it. And I paint that on the wet paper. I've wet the paper here as well, and this is Permanent Rose. I take the paint out of my brush now, and then I can pull that paint down just with my damp brush. And there it is finished. You can see how I've kept the back of the Protea quite light with lots of lost edges, which helps to make that area recede. And I've put my darkest colours on the front of the flower, which helps to make that area move forward. I'll be making a full-length tutorial of this painting for my Patreon site. It should be ready in August, I'd say, because there's a few tutorials that I have to post before this one. I hope this was helpful to you. Don't forget to give this video a like and please subscribe if you don't already. Have a fabulous week and I'll see you soon. Lately I've been trying to create more depth in my paintings. Today I want to show you what I did with this Protea painting. It's a painting of a Protea. I've talked before about values and how they help to create a sense of depth. Sense of depth. If you need to know about a sense of depth, you're in the right place. Lately, I've been trying to create more depth in my paintings. You know, depth. Depth. Lately, I use it to get some information. Spitting. Sorry. I'll be making a full-length tutorial of this painting for my Patreon site. It should be ready to be posted in August, I say. Should be ready to be posted in August. I say.